Welcome to the deep dive. Imagine a country where, well, 80% of it is just covered by one of the world's biggest deserts.
Yeah.
And it's sitting right on the ancient Silk Road. It holds this staggering amount of natural gas wealth. And officially, it maintains a status of permanent neutrality.
Quite a unique combination.
Exactly. That's Turkmenistan, a nation often seen as enigmatic, known for its unique path and pretty complex history.
Definitely complex.
So today, we're diving deep into a stack of sources you've provided. Our mission is basically to get you quickly up to speed on Turkmenistan. We're talking its geography, its turbulent past, shaped by empires.
Its culture, society, that resource-driven economy.
Right, and its place on the global stage. We'll try to cut through the noise, pull out those really important nuggets, and, connect the dots to give you the crucial context.
And we'll be drawing everything directly from the material you shared. So that means looking at everything from ancient civilizations and the Silk Road's legacy.
All the way through Russian and Soviet rule.
And then independence, the post-Soviet leadership, those unique cultural bits, vital resources, social dynamics, foreign policy, even environmental challenges, and, maybe surprisingly, its tourism potential.
It sounds like a lot, but we're going to unpack it. So this is a deep dive right into the heart of Central Asia. Okay, let's get started.
Let's do it.
So first things first, let's ground ourselves in the physical reality of Turkmenistan. The landscape, its ancient roots. Where exactly is this country, and what does it actually look like?
Okay, so Turkmenistan is strategically positioned right there in Central Asia. It sits on the eastern edge of the Caspian Sea.
And its neighbors.
Yeah, it borders Kazakhstan to the north, Uzbekistan to the northeast, Afghanistan to the east, and Iran to the south. It's pretty big land-wise. The sources give slightly different figures, either 488,100 or 491,200 square kilometers.
Wow, quite large.
Huge area. But interestingly, very sparsely populated, only about 5 to 6 million people total.
That's incredible. A really low population density. And you mentioned the desert dominates.
Oh, absolutely. The Garagum, sometimes called the Karakum Desert, it covers a massive 80% of the entire country.
80%.
Yeah, it's vast. Beyond that, the landscape isn't just flat desert. You've got mountain ranges like the Great Balkan and the Kopet Dag, large plains, and of course that vital coastline on the Caspian Sea.
And the climate must be pretty harsh.
Extremely arid. Think very dry, hot summers and then dry, cold winters. Rainfall is minimal, maybe 100 to 400 millimeters a year, tops. And dust storms are common.
Sounds challenging.
It is. But the material points out something interesting. Despite this harshness, there are unique microclimates and diverse flora and fauna, including some species you won't find anywhere else. So it's a land of extremes, but life finds a way.
Fascinating. So even in that environment, life thrives. Historically, who are the first people to call this place home?
Well, the sources say the earliest inhabitants were kind of a mix. You had nomadic cattle breeders roaming the steppes, And then you also had settled communities focused on agriculture and handicrafts. These were clustered around the vital oases, places like Merv, along the Amu Darya River, and in the foothills of the Kopet Dag Mountains.
So two different lifestyles interacting.
Exactly. And the sources describe this constant, mutually beneficial exchange. The nomads would trade things like wool, cattle, melons.
And the settled people.
They provide manufactured goods, clothes, jewelry, metal tools, things like that. Agriculture obviously was heavily dependent on irrigation in those oases, and these communities were already exporting some products.
And what about their beliefs, their spiritual world?
It seems the settled groups kind of blended elements of tribal shamanism, probably picked up from the nomads, with older ideas. These focused on the spiritual purity of nature, air, water, earth, and a sense of, good versus evil spirits. It reflects that mix of lifestyles again.
That blend of cultures really sets the stage for the next big topic, Turkmenistan's undeniable role on the Great Silk Road.
Yes, this is where Turkmenistan really played a crucial role in ancient times. The sources really highlight its position as a natural land bridge connecting east and west.
More than just a pathway.
Oh, much more. They emphasize that it included the widest part of the route that went through Central Asia. Key cities and regions like Merv, Khorasan, and the Kopet Dagh area were vital stopping points for the caravans.
So a real hub of activity.
Precisely. The Silk Road wasn't just about moving silk or spices. It was a massive melting pot. These cities flourished, becoming vibrant centers for, everything. Trade, banking, scholarship, art.
A place where East and West really met.
Truly interacted, yeah,
Yep.
and shaped each other. The sources even mention archaeological finds suggesting silk might have reached the Mediterranean much earlier than we usually think, even before the Western Han Dynasty. That hints at just how ancient and connected these routes were.
So the key takeaway is Turkmenistan wasn't just on the Silk Road.
It was a crucial crucible, a place where cultures mixed and mingled for centuries. That legacy is really important.
That legacy of interaction naturally leads us to the empires that swept through the region. Let's dive into those transformations, starting with the Parthians.
Okay, the Parthians, also called the Arkacids. They emerged around the 2nd century BC and were a pretty big deal. They built a large empire.
And they famously clashed with Rome, right?
That's right, went head-to-head with Rome for centuries. And what's notable, according to the sources, is that they managed to preserve their own state structure, their culture, and their religion over that really long period.
What was their lasting impact specifically on this region, on Turkmenistan?
Well, the sources point to their role in spreading Zoroastrianism northwards and also promoting Buddhism in parts of Central Asia. They kind of represent this significant cultural and civilizational link, showing continuity from the earlier Achaemenids and influencing later empires like the Sassanids.
Interesting.
Yeah, and the material raises some questions, things we don't fully know about how exactly they govern such diverse peoples, their economy, their specific contributions. These are highlighted as key areas of their legacy.
Okay, after the Parthians, a major cultural shift occurred with the arrival of Islam.
Yes, that was a huge turning point. Towards the end of the 1st millennium AD, you have the Arab conquest and the rise of the Arab Caliphate. This brought really dramatic political and cultural transformation. Turkmenistan became essentially part of the growing Islamic world.
What'd that mean practically for everyday life?
It ushered in pretty significant socioeconomic and cultural changes. The Arab conquest, starting in the 7th century, wasn't just about military might. It involved setting up new systems, new government, new courts.
New laws.
Exactly. Islamic law was implemented, and Arabic became the official language. The sources do mention there was initial resistance from the non-Islamic population.
Understandable.
Right. But ultimately, the conquest was completed by later Turkic and Persian dynasties, like the Samanids and the Karakanids. And cities in the Khorasan region, which included parts of modern Turkmenistan, really grew in importance during this time, fostering new levels of culture and opportunity.
And following that, another powerful Turkic group emerged, the Seljuks.
The Seljuks, yeah. They were an Oghuz Turkic tribe, and they became a major force around the 10th century. They established this huge empire that lasted roughly from 1037 to 1194.
And they expanded westward.
They did. They successfully challenged the weakening Abbasid Caliphate and seized territory across the Western Islamic world.
How did their style of rule compare?
According to the sources, the Seljuks were known for being relatively tolerant towards the lands they conquered. They often preferred using civil administration rather than just strict military control.
And the economy. Did the Silk Road continue to thrive?
Yes. Their empire saw great prosperity, largely driven by trade. The Silk Road routes continued to flourish under their watch. A key leader, Tugril, captured Merv and Khorasan, really cementing their hold on this vital region, and he was granted the title of Sultan.
But that prosperity didn't last forever. The Mongol invasion followed.
Right. The early 13th century brought a truly cataclysmic turning point with Genghis Khan. The sources describe his success stemming from several factors: a highly professional army, sophisticated espionage.
Intelligence gathering was key.
Crucial. Plus, he unified the previously fragmented Mongol tribes and employed a strategy the sources bluntly call a war of extermination. The existing powers in the region, like the Karakatans and the Khwarezmian Empire, were just caught completely off guard.
How did the invasion actually unfold? What were their methods?
Well, the Mongol armies swept in from the east, causing massive displacement of existing tribes. The sources detail their approach, relying heavily on that intelligence, using advanced war machines for sieges, and strategically employing treachery and clever stratagems to break down resistance. It was profoundly disruptive for everyone in the region.
A really devastating period. But after that turmoil, another major figure emerged, Timur, or Tamerlane.
Yes, Timur and the Timurid dynasty. This period from the late 14th to the late 15th centuries marked another significant era. Timur made Samarkand his capital.
And that became a center of culture.
It did. It's often referred to as a kind of golden age, particularly for the people in the Turkmen steppes during that time.
What defined Timurid rule according to the sources?
It was generally a time of relative prosperity. It attracted scholars, artists, architects. They fostered a really renowned architectural school. The sources paint Timur not just as this formidable military commander, but also as a shrewd diplomat and tactician who seemed to genuinely value knowledge.
There's a quote mentioned.
Yeah, something like, after the sword, a wise person removes the sword and transfers it to the pen, which is quite telling.
So a complex legacy, military power and cultural flourishing.
Exactly. It represents this sort of zenith of centralized power and cultural achievement. But it also led to fragmentation after Timur's death. The state got divided up among his descendants. And while historians talk about a great spilt between 1510 and 1611, the sources are careful to point out that culture didn't necessarily just decline in the new khanates that formed afterwards. It's that blend of military might and surprising patronage of arts and knowledge that stands out.
Okay, moving from those empires, we shift towards a more modern era of external control. Russian and later Soviet dominance. How did Tsarist Russia start its expansion into Central Asia?
By the mid-19th century, Tsarist Russia was actively pushing into Central Asia, invading and taking control of large areas. The sources lay out their motivations pretty clearly.
What were they? Resources, security.
Both. They wanted access to the resources in those wealthy oasis cities, places like Bukhara and Khiva. They also wanted to counter regional rivals like the Khanate of Bukhara and establish security against tribal raids coming out of the region.
So initially they focused further north.
Yeah, initially cities like Tashkent and Samarkand were the main targets, but Russian attention increasingly shifted south towards the Turkmen territories.
Was it an easy conquest?
Not always straightforward. The sources mention specific Russian military campaigns against Turkmen tribes that resisted, like the Yomud and the Tek. Integrating Turkmenistan into the Russian Empire really relied heavily on military force, but also on infrastructure projects.
Like the railway.
Exactly. The Trans-Caspian main railway was crucial. It allowed for rapid troop movement and easier access to resources.
And what were the consequences of this Russian control for the local people?
Well, it brought in Russian settlers and administrators, but the sources also state clearly that this led to abuses and created significant tensions. Initially, any kind of autonomous local government was very limited. Same for education opportunities and the reach of the Russian legal system.
Did they try to settle Russians there?
They did. The sources mention attempts at settling groups like Cossacks, peasants, even exiles, alongside efforts to recruit local labor. But settling the harsh desert environment proved really difficult.
So the strategy changed.
It seems so. When direct settlement didn't work as planned, the sources indicate Russia shifted towards a model of cultural assimilation, trying to Russify the local population. Central Asia was generally viewed by Russia as this land of abundance and resources, but also danger and instability, brigandage, as they called it.
So controlling it was paramount.
Yes. Their goals became curbing that brigandage, securing the borders, and controlling those vital trade routes, like for tea and silk. This led to much more careful preparations for campaigns compared to earlier disastrous ones, like the attempt against Khiva in the 1840s. They used commentators, geographers, made detailed maps.
So Turkmenistan became a key piece in this bigger imperial strategy.
Absolutely. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It faced significant initial resistance, of course, but the increasing Russian focus was driven partly by the climate challenges, but critically by its strategic location bordering potentially hostile Persia and other khanates, and also near areas of British interest.
Was there a specific turning point in the conquest?
The Russian capture of Okhaskala in 1869 is mentioned as a key moment. That pushed the empire's effective border further south, right down to the Amu Darya River.
This period of Russian control obviously paved the way for the Soviet era. What was the immediate impact of the 1917 October Revolution in this region?
Well, the revolutionary waves definitely reached Central Asia, and they brought significant changes. The sources observe a few things. Islam, as a political organizing force, had apparently weakened by then. Existing tribal tensions had fractured the power of the traditional khans.
And ordinary people.
They were starting to question the legitimacy of those old power structures, so the ground was shifting.
And this led to the formation of the Turkmen SSR.
Yes, the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic was formally created in 1921. But interestingly, the sources point out its borders didn't strictly follow ethnic Turkmen lines. They actually extended beyond the main Turkmen population areas.
How was it governed initially?
The initial government was often run by young local men, Turkmen themselves, but the key administrative posts, the real power positions, were typically held by Russians sent from the center.
What was the Bolshevik stance on these national republics?
It was complex, according to the material. Initially, they seemed to advocate for some kind of federation, but they also viewed the rapid creation of fully independent national states as, well, premature. The sources also discuss the Basmachi movement quite a bit. This was a major anti-Soviet uprising during the Civil War years.
What was behind it? Nationalism, religion.
It was complex, often linked to Turkic nationalism and Islamic identity, but it was a broad resistance movement, and it apparently received support from various factions, including even some former Russian military figures and imperialists.
That were their direct calls for independence.
Yes. The sources mention Turkic leaders appealing for independence. They even sent a telegram in 1920 demanding recognition for a Turkmen republic and warning Moscow against what they called false nationalism and expansive imperialism.
Let's shift to the economy under Soviet rule. The sources describe this paradox. Turkmenistan had rich resources, but the people had low living standards. How did that happen?
That's really a core insight from the material about the Soviet period. Despite Turkmenistan having abundant natural resources, huge amounts of gas, oil, minerals, and obvious potential in industries like cotton, the actual standard of living remained low. Social indicators were poor.
And the sources blame central planning.
Squarely. They attribute this directly to the inefficiencies of the Soviet central planning system, all directed from Moscow. It was a very rigid, top-down decision-making structure, and it was often marked by arbitrary changes made by ministers, even those who were appointed locally but still answered to the center.
So decisions about Turkmenistan's own resources weren't really made with local needs or even basic efficiency in mind.
Exactly. The decisions were made far away, often without understanding the local context. The sources talk about bureaucratic inertia, delays leading to lost time, missed profit opportunities.
Plus inefficiency.
Massive inefficiency, the lack of any kind of free market mechanism, and the inability to use resources rationally under that planned economy meant the potential just wasn't realized.
Are there specific examples mentioned?
Yeah, things like the difficulty of creating economically rational regional units within the republic, and the negative impacts of centrally planned prices, which distorted the real value of goods and really messed up agriculture and resource allocation. They mentioned disorganized cotton exports leading to huge losses and chaotic supply chains for other materials like gas resin.
So the takeaway is that Soviet central planning, even while extracting wealth, actively held back Turkmenistan's broader development.
That seems to be the clear message from the sources, yes. It hindered the potential for broad-based prosperity.
Okay, that era of tight central control eventually came to an end. How was the path towards independence in 1991 actually perceived within Turkmenistan?
It's interesting. The sources describe the perception of the Soviet coup attempt in August 1991 as being quite ambiguous within Turkmenistan. Unlike some other republics, there weren't initially these huge mass rallies.
Why was that? More isolated.
Partly its relative isolation and remoteness, yeah. But there was widespread discussion among the public. People were talking about it. And despite the leadership in Ashgabat initially trying to just ignore what was happening in Moscow,
They couldn't ignore it forever.
no. Secret communications lines were cut. And apparently some officials even started making preparations to hand over their official cars to Moscow, which really shows the uncertainty at the top.
So it wasn't like a sudden unified push for independence from the start.
It doesn't sound like it. The meeting of the Republic leaders on August 22nd was a major turning point, changing the whole political map. But the actual dissolution of the USSR on December 8th seems to have caught both the authorities and the general population somewhat by surprise.
And political groups started organizing.
Yes. The sources note that various political groups saw the perceived weakness of the ruling elite as an opportunity and started organizing protests. There's this thing called the open letter sent to Gorbachev.
What was that about?
It was huge, 138 pages apparently, with 380 specific questions detailing all sorts of economic and social problems in the Republic. There are also rallies by workers, and more written protests started appearing, including another open letter from 65 intellectuals. Although the sources also mention that schisms started developing within these nascent opposition movements pretty quickly.
So a complex internal dynamic.
Yeah.
And the official declaration of independence.
Turkmenistan officially gained independence after the USSR dissolved in late 1991, and the new republic immediately faced a whole host of critical tasks.
Like what?
Well, basically building a state from scratch, setting up institutions, figuring out its geopolitical orientation, dealing with cultural heritage questions, delineating borders, trying to revive the economy, joining the international community.
A huge undertaking.
Absolutely. The sources state that the Solemn Declaration of State Independence was the first major symbolic act. That was followed by adopting a constitution in June 1991, which was then amended in 1992. And crucially, declaring a neutral status early on.
When was the actual decision made?
It's noted that the decision on state sovereignty was actually made a bit earlier, back on October 27, 1990, after they considered some kind of proposed union treaty from Moscow. The formal declaration of state independence then came on August 30th, 1991.
Okay, let's talk about the challenges and characteristics of this post-Soviet era, especially under its first very long-serving president, Saparmurat Niyazov.
Right. Niyazov, or Turkmenbashi, leader of all Turkmens, as he called himself. The sources highlight that Turkmenistan, maybe more than other former Soviet republics, initially stuck pretty close to its Soviet past in some ways.
What were some early challenges?
Well, one thing mentioned is a lack of significant military spending early on. The sources suggest this might have actually encouraged potential domestic threats, although military modernization efforts and getting foreign help for weapons did start later. Niyazov himself came to power back in 1985 before the collapse and ruled right up until his death in 2006.
And he benefited from the oil and gas wealth.
Hugely. He really capitalized on a big surge in oil and gas revenues in the late 1990s, and this drastically transformed the state's finances.
But what were the downsides of his rule in this resource wealth?
Well, according to the sources, while the state coffers filled up, his rule was marked by pervasive corruption, nepotism, and serious mismanagement. There was reportedly a climate of fear where people just felt unable to speak out.
Any specific events mentioned?
Yes, a bank crash in 1997 is highlighted, attributed to weak regulation, and the sources describe an assassination attempt on Niyazov as a major turning point.
What happened after that?
It apparently led to deadly crackdowns on anyone perceived as an opponent, much tighter censorship, and the development of this really extensive cult of personality around him. The material suggests this also conveniently served to eliminate political rivals.
How did the outside world react?
Well, external actors apparently increased their scrutiny of human rights issues during this time, but simultaneously the state also selectively modernized its military, which the sources suggest was partly aimed at appeasing neighboring countries.
And after Niyazov died in 2006?
Demand for Turkmen gas reportedly dipped for a while, partly due to concerns about the new leadership, and also because of actions taken against fugitives and media outlets critical of the regime. The material sums up this period by saying that Turkmenistan's history, despite some positive developments, is marked by a pretty mixed record on rights and freedoms, directly reflecting the nature of Niyazov's rule.
That's a key point, the paradox of immense state wealth from resources.
Yeah, fueling both grand, often personality-driven projects and severe authoritarian control, rather than necessarily leading to broad societal benefit. That seems to be a central theme in the sources for this era.
Let's look a bit closer at that political landscape, maybe comparing Niyazov's time with the situation since then.
Okay. As we said, Niyazov dominated that early post-Soviet period, 1985 to 2006. And the sources make a striking point. Despite inheriting what was technically one of the richest Soviet republics because of its gas, it supplied over 75% of the USSR's needs, apparently.
Incredible percentage.
Right. But under his rule, Turkmenistan transformed into one of the poorest countries by some UN metrics. Even while it became a major gas supplier on the world stage, he's described as trying to completely monopolize control over those gas exports.
Which must have attracted international interest.
Definitely. Especially from the EU and the US, who are increasingly looking for ways to diversify their energy sources away from Russia. So Turkmen gas became very strategic.
His death in 2006 must have created a lot of uncertainty.
Absolutely. The sources describe it as a moment that presented big challenges internationally, but also a kind of dilemma internally. On the one hand, the prospects under his increasingly paranoid rule had looked pretty bleak.
But his passing maybe created an opening.
Potentially, yeah. An opening for a political elite beyond his immediate circle to maybe re-emerge. The material gives a bit of Niyazov's background, born in Kipchak village, 1940, from a tribal ruling family background, trained as an engineer.
Rose through the party ranks.
Yep. Rose through the Communist Party to become first secretary, then consolidated power by forming his own ruling clan, got full control over the state economy, and famously used those gas funds extensively to build palaces, presidential chambers, all sorts of things. Then the transition after his death. Gurbanguly, Berdymukhammedov, was initially declared temporary president, then formally elected as his heir.
Did he signal any changes?
Publicly, he committed to continuing Niyazov's neutral foreign policy and expanding cooperation. But he also hinted at maybe some degree of liberalization and formed a new political party, although its structure apparently mirrored Niyazov's established system pretty closely.
And how do the sources describe the political system now?
The current regime is characterized as a republic that's heavily dominated by the Democratic Party. The sources say other parties technically exist, but their actual activity is very limited.
What about the government structure, parliament?
There's a two-chamber parliament on paper, but the material suggests its real legislative power is quite constrained. It functions more in an advisory role. According to the sources, the president adopts most laws directly and also appoints the members of the upper house of parliament.
And how was power maintained?
Well, Niyazov himself was the undisputed leader of the party, and his power was underpinned by loyal ministers in the key security posts, the power ministries. The sources note that contradictions stemming from Niyazov's ideology still persist today, but things like weak institutionalization and limited genuine social support structures make any kind of radical systemic change very difficult.
Okay.
And it's worth repeating, as the sources do, that this reporting aims to be impartial, just relaying the political structure and dynamics described in the material provided.
Understood. Okay, let's shift gears now to the people and culture. What do the sources tell us about Turkmenistan's society and its demographics?
Right. It's definitely a country of contrasts demographically. We mentioned the large area, around 491,200 square kilometers, and the relatively small population, maybe 5.9 or 6 million. That makes it one of the least populous countries in the region.
And it shares that long border with Afghanistan.
Yes, its longest border is with Afghanistan, which is a key geopolitical factor. Ethnically, it's overwhelmingly Turkmen, about 85%, but there are significant minorities.
Like Russians, Uzbeks.
Exactly. Russians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Armenians, Ukrainians are all mentioned. And one striking thing the material points out is the rapid population growth.
Driven by high birth rates.
Yeah, high fertility rate. This means it's a very young population. Apparently 63% are under the age of 30.
Oh, that's young.
Very young. And there's a noticeable divide between urban and rural life, though both are apparently areas of government policy focus. About half the population lives in urban areas, with maybe a third concentrated just in the capital, Ashgabat.
Is there more diversity in the cities?
Generally, yes. Urban life shows more ethnic diversity. Rural areas, often multi-ethnic and multi-belief themselves, are highlighted as being potentially more vulnerable and also a focus for development policies, especially since, get this, 67% of the rural population is under 30.
Even younger in rural areas. How has ethnic identity played out since independence?
Well, after independence, there was apparently a strong political push to establish a clear ethno-national Turkmen identity. The sources mention policies that specifically targeted non-Turkmens.
Leading to discrimination.
That's what the sources state, yes. Discrimination and what they term denationalization policies. This created political and socioeconomic challenges for ethnic minorities. And this, combined with rural to urban migration trends, has apparently contributed to labor shortages in more recent years.
So population planning is complex.
Very complex, it seems. The sources frame it as needing a careful balance between managing demographic trends, social policies, and specific policies relating to those non-ethnic Turkmen populations.
Where do these minority groups typically live?
They often tend to be concentrated in border regions or in specific cities. Russians and other Slavic groups are mostly found in Ashgabat, Mary, and Turkmenabat. Uzbeks are more common in Turkmenabat and down in the southern borderlands.
Any other smaller groups?
Yeah, smaller groups like Iranians and Azeris are mentioned. Ashgabat itself is highlighted as being the most ethnically diverse city overall. And interestingly, Kazakhs are noted as migrating towards the western areas, apparently seeking land.
And within the Turkmen population itself, are there subdivisions?
Yes. The sources also reference internal Turkmen subdivisions based on traditional clans or tribes. Names like Tek, Yomut, and Goklan come up. And they mention the traditional dwelling, the yurt, still being significant.
Okay, that paints a clearer picture of the demographics. Now, what about the culture itself? The sources describe a really rich heritage, especially in folk arts.
Absolutely. Turkmen culture is depicted as incredibly rich, particularly its folk traditions. Music and dance are really prominent examples.
What's Turkmen music like?
It's known for its poetic quality, its melodic lines, and also a strong element of improvisation. It mainly exists in two forms, instrumental and vocal. The sources list various vocal genres, ghazel, koshak, others used to express emotions like love, friendship, things like that.
Is there a key instrument?
Yes, the dutar. It's a two-stringed instrument, and the sources call it the king of instruments. It's often played while the musician sings, apparently from the heart, serving as a vehicle for musical poetry.
And the dance traditions.
Traditional dances are said to go way back to ancient times, and they're closely linked to the music and poetry. They're described as reflecting the soul, the mood, the thoughts, the aspirations of the Turkmen people.
And influenced by horses.
Profoundly shaped by the cultural significance of the horse, yes, and also the value placed on faithfulness. There's even a characteristic way the audience shows appreciation mentioned in the sources, a nod of the head with a raised hand towards the performer.
Interestingly, the sources also comment on how some of this traditional music might have changed more recently.
Yes, that's a striking point in the material. It notes that some traditional, maybe more tender or romantic songs have, during certain periods of upheaval, transformed into something described using pretty strong language by the source, like raunchy and sexually aggressive anthems.
Quite a shift.
It sounds like it. However, the material also stresses that knowledge and respect for the traditional music and dance forms do still remain important in the culture.
What about literature and poetry? Also ancient traditions.
Very ancient art forms in Turkmenistan, yes. With historical figures who mastered both written and oral poetic traditions. Important historical masterpieces were apparently translated into Turkic and Turkmen languages over time.
But the sources seem quite critical of the modern state of poetry.
They offer a particularly stark assessment, yes, especially regarding how poetry is presented in public life today.
What's the description? It sounds quite negative.
It is. The material suggests that modern poetry, while sometimes honored at official state events, is often popularized in a way that feels very controlled. Poets are expected to deliver pre-prepared verses, apparently without improvisation.
And the content.
Potentially limited to offering praise only for official figures, maybe primarily the president. The sources use very blunt language here, describing the subject matter sometimes as moronic, lacking humanity, realism, calmness, and metaphors.
Focusing on mundane things.
Often dwelling on mundane events. Yeah, births, weddings, career promotions, even accidents, and delivered, apparently, in a very stern, formal voice. Even traditional performances like romals, often seen at weddings, are described as having sometimes devolved into crude nonsense.
That paints a picture of traditional forms struggling or being manipulated.
That seems to be the implication from the sources, yes. A potentially telling cultural insight into how traditions might be co-opted or changed in the modern era. The material does mention, though, that there are different official categories or titles for national poets.
That's a surprising contrast between the rich history and the modern description. Okay, let's shift focus now to the economy. The sources consistently emphasize Turkmenistan's incredible wealth of natural resources.
It is incredibly rich, yes. It possesses huge amounts of hydrocarbons, oil and gas, plus minerals, freshwater resources, and potential for renewables, too. But right now, of paramount interest are its natural gas reserves.
How large are they?
The sources rank them as the fourth largest in the entire world. They're mainly located in the Mary and Labat provinces in the east and also offshore in the Caspian Sea. Specific major fields like Gulkanish are mentioned by name.
And what about oil? Is that significant too?
Yes, significant oil reserves are also noted. They're concentrated mostly in the east and in the Balkan province near the Caspian. Total production of oil plus condensate is around 14 million tons per year, according to the figures provided.
Are there other resources that are key to the economy besides oil and gas?
Definitely. The sources list things like high-grade gypsum deposits and various types of decorative and construction rocks, granite, marble, limestone, sandstone. Some of these deposits, like a type of porous limestone called akbara and a white chalk called ahalgesh, are described as being of international significance.
And cotton, that was mentioned earlier.
Yes, cotton is highlighted as green gold. The sources distinguish Turkmenistan's cotton-growing areas, especially the Mir Plateau, saying they benefit from unique land conditions and irrigation support compared to other regions. That plateau is also noted as having a concentration of other agricultural resources, minerals, and vital water sources from the Murghab River and underground supplies.
So, immense wealth, but the economy is narrow.
That seems to be the core insight from the economic material. Despite this huge, concentrated natural wealth, the overall economy's output remains heavily reliant on pretty narrow parameters. And this is largely dictated by that closed nature of resource control we talked about earlier.
Okay, so beyond just extracting resources, what are the other major economic activities?
The main branches identified are agriculture and industry. It's important to note that almost all land is still state-owned.
Where is agriculture concentrated?
Mostly in the eastern and southern parts of the country, focused on crops and livestock. The vast pasture lands, especially in the drier central desert region, support livestock like sheep, goats, camels, donkeys, and of course, horses.
Including the famous Akaltek.
Absolutely, the world-renowned Akaltek horses, prized for their beauty, endurance, and speed. Caracals are also significant. These are mountain sheep that yield really valuable pelts.
And the main crop is still cotton.
Cotton is the primary crop, yes, grown on about 80% of all irrigated land, which requires those complex irrigation systems we discussed. Other crops mentioned include grapes, various horticultural products, rice, alfalfa, and flax. Poultry farming has also apparently developed, and traditional crafts like making felts and carpets from cotton and wool are internationally recognized products.
What about industry? Is it mostly processing?
A lot of it is processing, yes. Plants for meat, fish, vegetables, fruit, also soap, spirits, vegetable oil, and textiles, of course, cotton spinning and weaving plants, floor coverings.
And infrastructure development.
That's noted too. Specifically, highway and railway construction and conversion projects are mentioned. Helium production is also highlighted as having great importance, and it's pointed out that the Turkmen SSR was already an independent power producer connected to the wider regional grid, a status that continued after independence.
The sources also mentioned the agricultural transition after the Soviet Union collapsed. How did that go?
Well, there was apparently a gradual shift away from pure state property towards more collective and state farm models. The sources point to both challenges and gains from this.
Challenges like?
Losses in traditional feed and fodder supplies are mentioned as a negative consequence, but on the plus side, there was growth in intensive fruit and garden crops, feeding both fresh markets and the processing industries.
And they have the resources for agriculture.
The material notes abundant energy and water resources do support food and seed production and this intensive agriculture. They use various irrigation systems, including water-saving technologies, and the potential for research in geography, soil science, agronomy, irrigation is highlighted, as well as the ability to acquire technology from more developed countries.
So it's an ongoing adaptation.
Exactly. The key insight seems to be this complex, ongoing effort to adapt the agricultural sector away from the old, centrally planned model towards something more market-oriented, though still heavily state-controlled.
Okay, let's broaden the view now and look outwards at Turkmenistan's position in the world, particularly its strong emphasis on neutrality.
Yes. Turkmenistan's neutrality policy is really a defining characteristic. It's been recognized internationally for a long time now, and the sources state quite clearly that this policy has led to international recognition and has strengthened its relationships, both bilaterally and multilaterally.
And it's rooted in wanting friendly relations.
That's the stated desire. Yes, friendly relations with all countries. Its geography obviously plays a huge role here. Being located right at that junction of Asia and Europe, bordering 5 countries plus the Caspian Sea, it makes neutrality a strategically significant position.
Though the sources mentioned a lack of transport links south.
Right. They do note the lack of significant ground transport lines going southwards, and international freight flow through the region isn't really mentioned in the material we saw. But its location is still central to its foreign policy thinking.
So how does this neutrality actually translate into foreign policy actions?
Well, since independence, the diplomacy has focused on building strategic partnerships that align with Turkmenistan's economic and security interests. And these are safeguarded by various treaties. The sources mention a specific framework, something called Zero One-Way, Two-Way programs.
What are those about?
They seem designed to advance the political, economic, and security aspects of its neutrality policy. And this is pursued through multilateral cooperation working within international organizations like the UN, and also through something called a State Program for Cultural Liberty.
What about relations with its immediate neighbors? That must be critical.
Absolutely crucial. Relations with the bordering states, especially Uzbekistan and Iran, are emphasized as being very important. The sources consistently state that Turkmenistan pursues good, neighborly, friendly, and mutually beneficial relations, always stressing respect for national interests.
So active diplomacy.
Yes. Strengthening interstate relations, conducting mutual visits between leaders, proposing public dialogues, these are noted as key elements. Turkmen-Uzbek relations specifically have apparently been elevated to a formal strategic partnership.
viewing Uzbekistan as more than just a neighbor.
Exactly, as a strategic partner whose own stability and prosperity are seen as directly beneficial to Turkmenistan. The sources describe these Turkmen-Uzbek ties as historically deep-rooted and currently very strong, holding them up as an example of successful regional cooperation.
And beyond its immediate neighborhood, how does Turkmenistan engage globally?
It's described as actively participating in various multilateral partnerships. These focus on the economy, regional stability, and counterterrorism efforts. Its cooperation with the United Nations is particularly highlighted as being fruitful.
Any specific examples with the UN?
Yeah, the sources mention an exhibition and conference called Turkmenistan, the Heart of the Great Silk Road, held at the UN back in 1994, and a subsequent UN General Assembly resolution that supported Turkmenistan's goals. The UN specifically welcomed its non-aligned status.
Did it play a role regarding Afghanistan?
Yes, it actively supported UN peace efforts in Afghanistan, participating as a neutral state. This included a UN resolution in 1995 and hosting an international conference. Specific UN Security Council and ECOSOC resolutions on Afghanistan are mentioned in relation to Turkmenistan's role. It also hosted an international conference of neutral and non-aligned countries in Ashgabat in 1997, which issued its own declaration.
So neutrality is the foundation.
Absolutely. The key insight here seems to be that Turkmenistan actively used its declared permanent neutrality to shape its international identity and pursue very specific foreign policy goals, mainly within these multilateral frameworks. And the sources really emphasize that this status of permanent neutrality was formally granted by the UN on December 12, 1995. They even describe it as the first country in history to achieve this specific UN recognition.
That permanent neutrality status is definitely a fascinating and unique aspect of Turkmenistan. Now let's turn to some of the significant challenges the country faces, particularly on the environmental front.
Okay. According to the sources we looked at, the #1 environmental challenge facing Turkmenistan is desertification.
Which is land degradation.
Exactly. Land degradation in arid, semi-arid, and dry subhumid areas. It's caused by a combination of climate factors and human activity, and it's a serious global issue.
And given that 80% of Turkmenistan is already desert, this must be particularly acute there.
It's identified as the main environmental challenge, yes. The climate itself obviously plays a big role. Those extreme temperatures, minimal rainfall, low humidity, pervasive winds, they all contribute.
But human activity is also a factor.
Significantly so. The sources specifically point to human interventions during the Soviet era as being particularly destructive. The most prominent example given is the construction of the massive Karakum Canal.
How did the canal contribute to desertification? It was meant to bring water, right?
It was, and it is vital for irrigation and improving the quality of life in certain areas. But the sources state that it has also had this major collateral impact. It has actively promoted desertification in other areas.
How? Through seepage, salinity.
Largely due to problems with saline drainage water seeping out from the canal and irrigation systems into the surrounding desert. The effects are described as wind erosion, the expansion of gullies, and increasing salinization of the land itself.
Which harms vegetation.
Severely impacts vegetation, yes. And the sources expect these effects are likely to get worse with ongoing climate change. The key insight here is really this paradox. A crucial infrastructure project designed to bring life-giving water ended up exacerbating environmental degradation on a massive scale due to these unintended long-term consequences.
Which means managing the water resources they do have must be absolutely critical.
Fundamentally important. Turkmenistan's water resources are described as limited and also unevenly distributed across the country. This leads to severe shortages, especially down in the southern regions.
Where does the water supply mainly come from?
In the north, the main sources are the Amu Darya River and the Caspian Sea itself. The Amu Darya River is fed primarily by mountain precipitation and springs further upstream.
Didn't its course change historically?
Yes. The sources note its ancient path actually led to the Caspian Sea. But it shifted course sometime after the last ice age to flow into the Aral Sea basin instead. And this shift is mentioned as one factor contributing to the Caspian becoming saline over geological time.
Were measures taken to deal with salinity?
Measures like building dams and drainage systems were implemented historically, partly to prevent Caspian salinization. But these actions, in turn, caused other problems, like contributing to desertification, creating those saline drainage water issues, and leading to the loss of valuable agricultural land, which then required extensive recovery efforts.
So the Karakum Canal fits into this picture.
It's viewed partly as an outgrowth of efforts to rehabilitate water use from the Amudarya Basin, specifically designed to supply water to those drier southern regions. The sources mention ongoing projects aimed at improving water conveyance efficiency, reducing losses from the canals.
What about current water levels?
Recent assessments mentioned in the material show lower levels of mobile water resources, attributed partly to things like blowouts and losses from the system. But interestingly, the material speculates that the natural water levels might actually be higher now due to ongoing recovery works and new canal constructions. It's complex.
And the Caspian Sea level itself.
That's mentioned as a current topical issue. Its multi-year, somewhat unusual behavior with water levels fluctuating affects all the bordering countries and requires cooperative management efforts among them.
Okay, finally, let's wrap up this deep dive by looking at an area the sources suggest has significant potential: tourism. What does Turkmenistan offer visitors, according to the material?
Well, the sources describe Turkmenistan as relatively little known globally as a tourist destination, but potentially fascinating. And it seems the country is actively taking measures now to promote tourism more.
What are the main attractions highlighted?
It offers quite a blend. You've got the unique, modern architecture of the capital, Ashgabat. Then there's the stark, unique nature of the Karakum Desert itself. The Caspian Sea coastline offers possibilities. And of course, those incredibly rich, ancient Silk Road cities like Merv and Konya-Urgench.
Are there day trips mentioned?
Yeah, the material lists possible nearby day trips, including Barana Tower and Nohur Monastery. It also mentions Ardabil, although it's probably worth noting for listeners that Ardabil is actually across the border in Iran, so maybe it's listed as a point accessible from the border region.
What's Ashgabat itself like, as described in the sources?
It's described pretty vividly, like a giant Lego city, is the phrase used, emphasizing that it's been built relatively recently.
Lots of white marble.
Overwhelmingly white, shiny pastel buildings, yeah. Made of concrete or marble, adorned with arches, domes, columns, skyscrapers, plus lots of fountains and parks. The sources acknowledge it can sometimes come across as, quote, gaudy and surreal.
And also impressive.
But they also note it contains genuinely harmonious and stunning structures. So the new, clean, modern city itself is presented as a key tourist attraction, almost an exhibit in its own right.
And the desert, the Karakum. What's the appeal there?
For nature and adventure tourism, the sources suggest the Karakum has no regional equals. It's sparsely populated, of course, but dotted with natural springs, traditional yurts, and camels.
Any specific natural wonders?
Yes, Lake Tengrides is mentioned, good for photography, picnics, just relaxing. Also, the singing dunes of Koytundag are highlighted as a place of wonder, great for trekking and apparently watching the sunrise from tents pitched nearby, plus colorful canyons and cave systems.
What about the Caspian Sea as a tourist draw?
Yes, that's highlighted too. As one of the world's largest lakes, it's presented as a unique destination. The sources mention its vast vanishing horizon, the presence of freshwater dolphins, which is quite unique, and white pelicans.
Suitable for beach holidays.
Conditions are described as being good for traditional beach vacations, yeah, but also for activities like scuba diving, sailing, and fishing.
Moving beyond the big Silk Road cities like Merv and Konya-Urgench, what other historical sites are mentioned?
Turkmenistan is clearly rich in cultural heritage and historical sites beyond those UNESCO ones. The sources mention numerous ruins potentially still hidden by the desert sands, just waiting to be discovered.
And the Darvaza gas crater.
Ah, yes, the Gate to Hell. That's singled out as a unique natural feature, but one that's become a major tourist draw. It offers this really striking contrast to the country's mountains and forests.
Horses are important too.
Hugely important culturally. The national pride in taming the horse, particularly the beautiful and famously enduring Akkalteka breed, is highlighted. And horse riding tours are offered as an exciting activity for visitors. Even traditional hunting with the Turkmen greyhound for chamois is mentioned as still attracting experts.
Any health tourism?
Yes, balneological health resorts, like the Oaza complex on the Caspian coast, are noted as meeting international standards. And just to elaborate slightly on those key historical sites mentioned, Merv is described not just as a city, but as a crucial starting point for Silk Road caravan routes, a major medieval center of science, culture, art, known historically for its gardens and fountains. Various monuments and burial mounds are still visible there.
And Nisa?
Nisa is presented as this ancient city fortress, a unique architectural monument. And significantly, the sources identify it as the originator city of the Parthian state we discussed earlier. Remains are preserved today.
And Old Urgench.
Old Urgench is called a priceless jewel. Its ruins lie along the Amu Darya River. It was once a large, thriving city during the medieval period, and it provides a really rich site for historical investigation.
Okay, besides the desert, are there other natural attractions highlighted? Mountains, caves?
Yes, the sources emphasize Turkmenistan's largely unexplored natural beauty beyond the desert, including caves, mountains, and waterfalls. Mount Bakardin, which is over 2,500 meters high in the Kopetdag Ridge, is mentioned,
And waterfalls.
along with the picturesque Bakardin Valley, which apparently features waterfalls like the Great Bakardin Waterfall, 36-meter high,
Yeah.
and the small Bakardin Waterfall, 10-meter. Bakardin Lake is also noted as historically significant, having expanded naturally in the past, though its upper part has since dried up, with forests now planted around it.
And caves seem important.
Bakardin Cave specifically is called out as a famous tourist destination. It's believed, according to the sources, to be one of the greatest and most beautiful caves in the world. It features majestic halls, columns, even a river flowing through it, and most uniquely, a hot spring lake inside the cave.
Are there many caves?
The sources point out that Turkmenistan actually has over 50 known caves, mostly located in the Kopetbag Mountains, including Bakardin, Nohur, and Kavak, among others. So lots of potential for spelunking and exploration, too.
Wow. We have certainly covered a tremendous amount of ground today, really pulling insights directly from all that material you provided on Turkmenistan.
I really have.
From its ancient past as this Silk Road crucible, shaped by these powerful empires, through the really complex legacies of Russian and then Soviet control, its unique path to independence, and the realities under its post-Soviet leaders.
And we've explored its distinctive culture, both the rich traditions and some of those modern complexities mentioned in the sources, plus its economy, so rich in resources, but managed in that paradoxical way.
Right, and its defining policy of neutrality, those significant environmental challenges like desertification and water management, and finally, its potential, maybe untapped, as a tourist destination.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a concise but still pretty comprehensive understanding of this fascinating and often overlooked country. We've really tried to synthesize the information from all those different sources to paint a clearer picture.
Yeah, and understanding a place like Turkmenistan, I think, with its deep blend of ancient history and very modern challenges, its immense wealth contrasted with those internal difficulties, its unique geopolitical position of permanent neutrality, and its rich cultural heritage, which seems, based on the sources, sometimes constrained. It offers really vital perspectives.
Perspectives on what?
Well, on geopolitics, definitely.
Mhm.
On resource economics and management, on cultural adaptation and preservation, and just generally on the diverse paths nations take, especially those emerging from larger historical unions like the Soviet Union.
That makes sense. And if we try to connect all this to the bigger picture, considering Turkmenistan's really unique geopolitical location, right there bordering Afghanistan and Iran.
Plus its status as a major global holder of natural gas.
Exactly. And its formally recognized permanent neutrality, alongside those complex internal dynamics shaped by its unique history. What could its role realistically look like in the global energy landscape and in regional stability in the coming years?
That's a huge question.
It is. And also, how might its deep cultural heritage, which, as we heard, is sometimes described in pretty stark terms in the sources when discussing contemporary expression, how might that continue to evolve in the 21st century? How do all these factors intersect and shape its future? It definitely raises some important questions for you to think about.